The whole town watched as Clara Whitmore knelt in blood-soaked sawdust, her hands buried inside a 14-year-old's mangled flesh, while grown men turned away in horror. 20 minutes earlier, these same people had laughed when Margaret Dunn called her a fraud in the middle of Main Street. Now they stood silent, watching this strange woman fight death itself with nothing but a needle, thread, and steady hands that refused to shake. When the boy's fingers twitched and someone gasped, Clara didn't look up. She just kept working. This is the story of how a town learned what real strength looked like. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The first thing people noticed about Clara Whitmore was that she didn't belong. She arrived in Briar Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late November, stepping off the supply wagon with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a coat that had seen better winters. The driver didn't wait for payment, just tipped his hat and urged his horses forward like he couldn't leave fast enough. Clara stood alone in the rutted street while frost clung to her dark hair and her breath made small clouds in the bitter air. She was maybe 25, maybe 30, hard to tell. Her face had that peculiar quality of someone who'd seen too much too young. Smooth skin around eyes that looked decades older. She wasn't beautiful in the way the town's women were beautiful, with their carefully pinned hair and Sunday dresses. Clara looked like she'd been carved from something harder, sharper, like flint that could strike fire if you weren't careful. The general store owner, Henry Polk, watched from his window as she crossed toward the boarding house. "Another drifter," he muttered to his wife. "Winter brings 'em out like rats." But Clara wasn't looking for handouts. She had money, not much, but enough. What she needed was work, and in a frontier town like Briar Ridge, that meant proving herself useful before the first heavy snow trapped everyone in place for 3 months. The boarding house turned her away. So did the hotel above the saloon. "Full up," they said, though Clara could see empty rooms through the windows. She didn't argue, just adjusted her satchel and kept walking. By noon, word had spread. A stranger in town, young woman, traveling alone, carrying some kind of medical bag. "Says she's a healer," the blacksmith's wife whispered to the seamstress. "Showed up asking if anyone needed doctoring. We've got Doc Brennan for that. Doc Brennan left for Sacramento 2 weeks ago. Won't be back till spring." "Well, we don't need some woman poking around in people's business." The seamstress agreed, though privately she wondered. Her youngest had been coughing for a week, and the fever wasn't breaking. But asking this stranger for help felt like admitting something shameful, like the town wasn't good enough to take care of its own. Clara spent the afternoon walking. She noted the mill at the edge of town, the smell of fresh-cut lumber mixing with wood smoke. She counted 3 churches, 2 saloons, 1 schoolhouse. The general store, the feed shop, the livery stable, everything a small town needed to survive, arranged along a single mud-churned street that would turn to ice within days. She didn't approach anyone, didn't offer her services or try to make friends. She just walked, learning the rhythm of the place, reading it the way she'd learned to read a dozen towns before this one. By the time the sun started sinking behind the western ridge, Clara had made a decision. She'd stay 1 more night, sleep in the livery if she had to, and move on in the morning. Briar Ridge didn't want her. That was fine. Most towns didn't. That's when Margaret Dunn found her. Margaret was a large woman, both in body and presence. She ran the boarding house with an iron fist and a tongue that could strip paint. Her late husband had owned half the businesses in town before drinking himself into an early grave, and Margaret had inherited everything: the property, the respect, and the unspoken authority to decide who belonged in Briar Ridge and who didn't. Clara was standing outside the feed store, adjusting her coat against the wind, when Margaret's voice cut through the evening air like a saw blade. "You!" Clara turned slowly. Margaret stood 20 feet away with her arms crossed and 3 other women flanking her like an honor guard. "I hear you've been telling people you're some kind of doctor." Clara's expression didn't change. "I'm a healer. There's a difference." "You got papers? Training?" "I have experience." Margaret's laugh was harsh. "Experience. That's what they all say before someone dies and they disappear in the night." She took a step closer. "We don't need your kind here. Whatever you're selling, we're not buying." A small crowd had started to gather. Men leaving the mill, women heading home from the market. In a town this size, confrontation was entertainment. Clara could have walked away. Should have. But something in Margaret's tone, that absolute certainty that she knew exactly what Clara was, struck a nerve she'd buried years ago. "I'm not selling anything," Clara said quietly. "I help people, that's all." "Help!" Margaret spat the word. "My cousin's husband died because of help from a woman like you. Fever took him while she fed him herbs and prayers instead of real medicine." She raised her voice so everyone could hear. "This is a respectable town. We don't need frauds and con artists pretending to be doctors." The word fraud hung in the cold air. Clara's hands tightened on her satchel, but her face remained calm. She'd heard worse, been called worse. In Ellsworth, they'd accused her of witchcraft. In Silver Creek, they'd blamed her when a child died of scarlet fever. Never mind that the family had waited until the boy was nearly dead before calling her. "I've never lied about what I can do," Clara said, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest. "And I've never taken money from someone I couldn't help." "Then you must not make much money." Margaret smiled and several people laughed. Clara felt the familiar weight of it, the mockery, the judgment, the way people looked at her like she was something dirty they'd stepped in. She could defend herself, list the lives she'd saved, the children she'd delivered, the infections she'd stopped from spreading. But experience had taught her that people like Margaret Dunn didn't want truth. They wanted someone to blame, someone to feel superior to. So Clara did what she always did. She stayed silent. Margaret took that silence as victory. "That's what I thought. Nothing to say because there's nothing to prove." She turned to address the crowd. "This woman is a fraud. Anyone who takes her medicine does so at their own risk. I won't have it said that Briar Ridge welcomes liars and thieves." The crowd murmured agreement. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Clara stood alone in the middle of Main Street with the sunset painting everything gold and red behind her, and all she could think was that she'd wasted a day and a half of travel for nothing. Then the screaming started. It came from the direction of the mill, a raw animal sound that made everyone freeze. A man's voice, hoarse with panic. "Help! Someone help!" The crowd turned as one. 2 mill workers came running, half carrying a third between them. Even from a distance, Clara could see the blood. It soaked the injured man's sleeve, dripped onto the frozen mud, left a trail like breadcrumbs. "Tommy Breslin," someone whispered. "Oh, Jesus." The crowd parted as the workers struggled forward. The injured boy, because he was a boy, Clara saw now, maybe 14 or 15, had his right hand wrapped in a rapidly soaking cloth. His face was white as milk, his eyes rolling back. "Machinery caught him," one of the workers gasped. "Belt snapped. His hand went through the saw housing." Someone screamed. A woman fainted. The men holding Tommy looked around wildly, waiting for someone to step forward and take charge. No one moved. "Where's Doc Brennan?" someone shouted. "Sacramento! Won't be back for months." "Then someone get—" Panic rippled through the crowd. The boy's knees buckled, and the workers nearly dropped him. Blood pooled in the street, steaming in the cold air. Clara was moving before she made the conscious decision to move. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the gasps and protests. Up close, the damage was worse than she'd feared. The makeshift bandage had already soaked through, and the boy's breathing was rapid and shallow. Shock. He'd be dead in minutes if someone didn't act. "Bring him inside," Clara said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The feed store. Now." Nobody moved. Clara looked up and found Margaret Dunn staring at her with an expression caught between horror and fury. "You touch that boy, and He's dying." Clara's voice was flat. "You can hate me later. Right now, get him inside or watch him bleed out in the street. Your choice." For 3 long seconds, no one breathed. Then a man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Silas Boone was not a man who drew attention to himself. He ran a cattle ranch 5 miles outside town and came into Briar Ridge maybe twice a month for supplies. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that had more gray than brown and eyes the color of winter sky. He'd lost his wife to childbed fever 3 years back, and people said he'd buried his heart right alongside her. Now he walked through the crowd like it wasn't there and looked down at Clara with an expression she couldn't read. "Can you save him?" Clara met his gaze. "I don't know, but I can try." Silas nodded once. Then he bent down, lifted Tommy Breslin like he weighed nothing, and carried him toward the feed store. "Someone open the damn door!" The feed store owner, a nervous man named Fletcher, fumbled with his keys while Clara followed Silas inside. The crowd pressed in behind them, filling the doorway, craning to see. "Clear that table," Clara ordered, pointing to a workbench along the far wall. Silas swept tools and papers onto the floor with one arm and laid Tommy down as gently as if he were made of glass. Clara set her satchel on a barrel and opened it with quick, precise movements. Inside, bottles of tinctures, packets of dried herbs, clean cloth strips, a leather roll of surgical instruments that caught the lamplight. The boy was barely conscious now, his eyes glazed and unfocused. Clara unwrapped the blood-soaked bandage and someone behind her made a choking sound. Tommy's hand was destroyed. 3 fingers nearly severed, the palm laid open to the bone, tissue macerated and torn. The saw had chewed through skin, muscle, and tendon like they were paper. "Holy God," Fletcher whispered. "Her son." Clara's expression didn't change. She'd seen worse. Not much worse, but worse. And she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this boy kept his hand, lost his hand, or lost his life. "I need hot water," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Clean as you can get it. Towels. And whiskey. The strongest you have." No one moved. Clara looked up and found a dozen faces staring at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Now," she said, and the snap in her voice broke the spell. People scattered. Fletcher ran for his back room where he kept a stove. His wife started pumping water. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that definitely wasn't for medicinal purposes. Clara turned to Silas, who hadn't moved from Tommy's side. "I need you to hold him down. When I start working, he's going to fight." Silas positioned himself at the boy's shoulders, his big hands gentle but firm. "Do what you need to do." Clara selected a pair of small scissors from her roll and began cutting away destroyed tissue. Tommy jerked and cried out, and Silas held him steady without a word. The crowd watched in horrified silence as Clara worked. She moved with absolute focus, each motion deliberate and controlled. Cleaning the wound with whiskey that made Tommy scream. Identifying which fingers could be saved. Using needle and thread, impossibly thin, impossibly precise, to close torn blood vessels before he bled out entirely. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. Her hands were covered in blood up to the wrists. And still she didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't show even a flicker of doubt. Time became strange, minutes stretched like hours. The only sounds were Tommy's ragged breathing, the whisper of thread through torn flesh, and the hiss of the lamp overhead. Then Clara tied off the final suture, wrapped the hand in clean cloth, and sat back. Tommy had passed out halfway through. His face was gray, his breathing shallow, but steady. Alive. Clara looked at the ruined hand. 3 fingers saved, 1 lost, palm closed, bleeding stopped, and felt the familiar exhaustion that came after pushing her skill to its absolute limit. "He needs to stay warm," she said, her voice hoarse. "Watch for fever. Change the bandages twice a day. Keep it clean." She started packing her instruments, her hands shaking now that the emergency had passed. Blood stained her sleeves, her skirt, her hands. Silas was staring at her with an expression she couldn't name. "You saved his hand," he said quietly. "Most of it." Clara didn't look up. "Whether it works again depends on how well he heals. But he's alive. For now." The crowd hadn't moved. They stood frozen in the doorway, watching Clara clean blood from her scissors with a scrap of cloth. The same people who'd laughed while Margaret called her a fraud now looked like they'd witnessed something holy. Margaret Dunn was nowhere to be seen. Tommy's mother pushed through the crowd, her face wet with tears. She reached for her son, then stopped, looking at Clara with an expression caught between gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. We don't have much, but don't worry about payment." Clara closed her satchel. "Just keep him warm and quiet." She stood, swaying slightly. The room tilted, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. When was the last time she'd eaten? Yesterday morning, maybe. Silas's hand appeared under her elbow, steadying her. "You need food," he said, "and rest." Clara pulled away gently. "I'll be fine." "The boarding house is full and the hotel won't take you." It wasn't a question. Silas had seen how things stood. "My ranch is 5 miles north. I've got a spare room." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Saw the grief lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man who'd learned not to hope for much. Saw something else too. something that looked like recognition. I don't accept charity. Good, because I'm offering work. Silas gestured toward Tommy. You just proved this town needs a healer. Winter's coming, and people get hurt, get sick. You could stay at the ranch, come into town when needed. He paused. Room and board in exchange for doctoring anyone who asks. It was a better offer than Clara had any right to expect, but she'd learned to be cautious about kindness. It usually came with conditions. Why? She asked bluntly. Silas considered the question. Because that boy would be dead if you weren't here. And because I watched Margaret Dunn call you a fraud while you stood there and took it. He met her eyes. Anyone who can swallow that much pride without breaking probably has good reason. I respect that. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the armor she'd built around herself. 1 month, she said, trial period. If it doesn't work, I leave. No hard feelings. Silas nodded. Fair enough. They shook hands there in the feed store, surrounded by blood-stained cloth and the smell of whiskey and fear. And though neither of them knew it yet, that handshake sealed something bigger than a simple work arrangement. It sealed both their fates. The ride to the Boone Ranch took an hour through deepening darkness. Silas had a wagon, old but sturdy, and Clara sat beside him while the horse picked its way along a rutted trail that climbed into the foothills. Snow had started falling, small dry flakes that hissed against the frozen ground. They didn't talk. Clara was too exhausted, and Silas didn't seem like a man who wasted words. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd both learned that talking didn't fix things. The ranch appeared gradually through the snow, a low cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn that looked hand-built, corrals that held maybe 30 head of cattle. Simple, practical, lonely. Silas pulled up near the porch. Spare rooms through the kitchen. I'll bring your things. Clara climbed down, her legs stiff from cold and exhaustion. Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. The furniture was rough but well made. Everything had the feel of a place where someone lived but didn't really inhabit. Like Silas existed here, but nothing more. The spare room was small. A bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over dark hills. Someone had left blankets folded at the foot of the bed and a lamp on the dresser. Clara sat down heavily and stared at her hands. They'd stopped shaking, but the blood under her nails reminded her of Tommy Breslin's destroyed palm, the way his fingers had hung by threads of tissue, the sound he'd made when the whiskey hit open nerves. She'd saved him. Probably. Unless infection set in, or the hand didn't heal right, or any of a dozen other things that could still go wrong. A knock at the door. Come in. Silas entered carrying a plate of bread, cheese, and cold meat. It's not much. It's perfect. Clara took the plate and realized she was starving. Silas hesitated in the doorway. The town will talk about you staying here. Let them talk. They'll make assumptions. Clara looked up at him, too tired to be anything but honest. They already have. That's what people do. She took a bite of bread. If you're worried about your reputation, I'm not. Silas's expression was unreadable. Just wanted you to know what you're walking into. I've walked into worse. Another pause. Then Silas nodded and turned to leave. Thank you, Clara said quietly. He stopped. For what? For stepping forward, when no one else would. Silas looked back at her, and for just a moment something vulnerable crossed his face. Someone had to. Then he was gone, pulling the door closed behind him. Clara finished her meal in silence, listening to the wind pick up outside and the fire settle in the main room. Through the thin wall, she could hear Silas moving around. The creak of floorboards, the scrape of a chair, the sound of a man going through the motions of evening routines he'd probably done alone for years. She should feel relief, gratitude. She had shelter, food, and the possibility of work. More than she'd had this morning. But what Clara felt was something more complicated. Because in Silas Boone's brief defense of her, in his willingness to carry Tommy Breslin into that feed store despite the crowd's judgment, she'd recognized something she hadn't seen in a long time. Integrity. Not the loud, performative kind that people wore like Sunday clothes. The quiet kind. The kind that acted because it was right, not because anyone was watching. Clara lay down without undressing, pulled the blankets over her blood-stained clothes, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the snow fell harder, beginning to cover the world in white. And somewhere in Briar Ridge, Tommy Breslin either lived through the night or didn't. All Clara could do was wait. And in the morning, if there was a morning, she'd do what she always did. She'd keep fighting, keep trying, keep proving to a world that didn't want her that she deserved to exist anyway, even if it killed her. Tommy Breslin didn't die that night, or the next. By the third morning, his fever broke and his mother showed up at the ranch with a basket of eggs and eyes red from crying. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, standing on Silas's porch like she was afraid to come closer. "The doc in Sacramento couldn't have done better, maybe worse." Clara took the eggs and tried to smile. "How's the hand?" "Swollen. Hurts something awful, but he can feel his fingers and they move when he tells them to." Mrs. Breslin twisted her apron. "That's good, right? That they move?" "It's good. Keep changing the bandages. If the swelling gets worse or you see red streaks, come find me immediately." Mrs. Breslin nodded and backed away like Clara might change her mind about helping. As she climbed into her wagon, she called back, "Margaret Dunn saying you got lucky, that anyone could have done what you did." Clara didn't respond. She just stood there holding the egg basket while Mrs. Breslin drove off, and when she turned around, Silas was watching from the barn doorway. "You're not going to defend yourself," he said. "Not a question." "Would it matter?" "Probably not." He walked closer, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "But it might make you feel better. I stopped caring about feeling better a long time ago." Clara headed back inside and Silas didn't follow. The truth was, Clara had learned that defending herself only made things worse. People didn't want explanations. They wanted someone to judge. And the more you fought back, the guiltier you looked. So she did what she always did. She worked. The first week at the Boone Ranch, 3 people came seeking help. A farmer with an infected cut on his arm. A woman whose baby wouldn't stop crying and wouldn't nurse. A ranch hand who'd been kicked by a horse and couldn't straighten his leg. Clara treated them all in the small spare room that was slowly becoming her workspace. She cleaned infections, identified colic, manipulated a dislocated kneecap back into place. Each time, the patients looked at her like they expected her to fail. And each time, when she didn't, they left looking confused. Silas watched it all without comment. He'd rise before dawn to tend his cattle, work until dark fixing fences and mucking stalls, then come inside smelling like horses and leather and snow. They'd eat dinner in near silence. Clara wasn't much for conversation, and Silas seemed to prefer it that way. But slowly, things began to shift. It started small. Silas began leaving the coffee pot on the stove for her in the mornings. Clara started cooking extra at dinner so he'd have something decent to eat. Neither acknowledged the gestures, but they kept happening. Then the weather turned. The first real blizzard hit Briar Ridge in mid-December, and it hit hard. Snow fell for 3 straight days, piling up against the cabin walls and burying the fence posts. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the well, and the cattle huddled together in the barn like their lives depended on it, which they did. Silas spent hours breaking ice, hauling feed, making sure none of his herd froze to death. Clara helped when she could, though she knew nothing about ranching. But she could carry buckets and scatter hay, and Silas didn't tell her to stop. On the 3rd night, he came inside with his face nearly frostbitten and his hands so stiff he couldn't work the buttons on his coat. Clara sat him down by the fire and made him drink hot coffee while she rubbed feeling back into his fingers. "You're going to lose toes if you keep this up," she said, checking his feet for blackened skin. "Can't lose the herd." His voice was hoarse from breathing frozen air. "It's all I've got." Clara looked up at him, this man who'd barely spoken 50 words to her in 2 weeks, and saw something she recognized. Desperation. The kind that came from holding on to the last thing in the world that mattered. "When did you eat last?" Silas frowned. "This morning." "That was 16 hours ago." Clara stood and went to the stove. "You're no good to those cattle dead." She made stew from the last of the vegetables and some dried beef, and when she set the bowl in front of him, Silas stared at it like he'd forgotten what food looked like. "I can manage on my own," he said quietly. "I know you can." Clara sat across from him with her own bowl. "But you don't have to." Something passed between them then, an understanding that didn't need words. They were both people who'd learned to survive alone. But maybe survival didn't have to mean isolation. Silas ate his stew, and Clara pretended not to notice when he went back for seconds. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of snow. The sun came out bright and merciless, turning everything into blinding white. And with the sun came people. First was a rancher from 2 miles east who'd run out of medical supplies for his wife. She'd cut her hand on broken glass, and the wound had festered. "Can't get to town," he said, standing in Silas's doorway with snow up to his knees. "Roads are completely blocked. Someone said there was a healer staying here." Clara treated the woman in her room, cleaning the infection and packing the wound with a poultice that smelled sharp and medicinal. The woman cried from pain but held still, and when Clara finished, the rancher pulled out a small leather pouch. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing." He blinked. "Nothing? Just keep it clean and come back if it gets worse." Clara walked him to the door. "And next time, don't wait 4 days to ask for help." After they left, Silas looked at her from his chair by the fire. "You should charge them. They don't have money to spare." "Neither do you," Clara shrugged. "I've got a roof and food. That's more than some." Silas didn't argue, but something in his expression shifted, like he was seeing her from a different angle. The next person who came was a mother with a sick child. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, burning with fever and struggling to breathe. Clara examined her in the lamplight and felt her stomach drop. Pneumonia. The child's lungs were filling with fluid, and out here, miles from town with snow blocking every road, there was almost nothing Clara could do. Almost. She spent the next 6 hours fighting for that little girl's life. Steam treatments to loosen the congestion, tinctures to bring down the fever, a poultice on the chest to help her breathe. And when the child's breathing got so shallow that her lips turned blue, Clara did something she'd only done twice before. She made a small incision between the ribs and drained the fluid directly from the lung cavity. It was dangerous. Insane, really. One wrong move and the child would die in seconds. But Clara's hand stayed steady, and when the fluid came out yellow and thick, the little girl gasped and her color started to return. The mother sobbed. Clara just cleaned her instruments and prayed, though she didn't believe in prayer, that she hadn't just traded one death for another. Silas had watched the whole thing from the doorway. When the mother and child finally left near midnight, he brought Clara a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "Where did you learn to do that?" Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. "A surgeon in Omaha. He was dying of consumption, and I took care of him for 3 months. In exchange, he taught me everything he knew." "Everything?" "Enough." She met his eyes. "Enough to know how much I don't know." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You could have killed that child." "I know. But you didn't hesitate." "Would you have? If it was the only chance she had?" Silas considered this. "No, I wouldn't have." They sat in silence after that, drinking coffee while the fire burned low. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling around the cabin like a living thing. And Clara realized with something close to surprise that she wasn't afraid. Not of the storm, not of the isolation, not of the judgment that would surely come when word spread about what she'd done tonight. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt something like peace. The word spread faster than the blizzard had. By the end of the week, half of Briar Ridge knew that Clara Whitmore had drained a child's lungs with nothing but a knife and steady hands. Some people called it a miracle. Others called it witchcraft. Margaret Dunn called it reckless. "She could have killed that child," Margaret announced in the general store, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Cutting into a baby like she's butchering a pig. It's barbaric." "But the child lived," someone pointed out. "This time. What about next time? What happens when her luck runs out and someone dies?" Margaret's face was red. "Mark my words, this woman is dangerous." The whispers followed Clara into town when she finally made it in for supplies. People stared as she walked down Main Street. Some looked grateful. Most looked nervous. A few looked outright hostile. Clara bought flour, coffee, and lamp oil at the general store. Henry Polk took her money without making eye contact. "Heard you've been busy," he said, counting out her change. "People get sick in winter. It happens." "They're saying you can do things regular doctors can't." Clara looked at him directly. "I do what I can with what I have, same as anyone." She left before he could respond. Outside, the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and the sky was the color of old iron. More snow coming, always more snow. Silas was waiting by the wagon, loading feed sacks. He glanced at her as she approached. How bad was it? I've had worse. That's not an answer. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat. Margaret Dunn thinks I'm dangerous. Half the town agrees. The other half is just waiting to see if I fail. She looked at him. So, pretty much the same as everywhere else. Silas swung up beside her and took the reins. For what it's worth, I don't think you're dangerous. What do you think I am? He considered this as the wagon lurched forward. Stubborn, maybe a little reckless, but good at what you do. He paused. And brave, in a way most people aren't. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They rode in silence back toward the ranch, and halfway there, it started snowing again. December bled into January, and the work didn't stop. Clara treated frostbite, broken bones, influenza, infections that turned ugly in the cold. She delivered 2 babies, one breech, one perfectly normal, and saved a man who'd nearly cut his leg off with an axe. Every time someone came to the ranch seeking help, Silas was there. He'd open the door, bring them inside, make sure they had coffee or water while they waited. He never questioned Clara's methods or doubted her decisions. He just stood back and let her work. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. It started one night after a particularly difficult case. A ranch hand with a badly broken arm that Clara had to set without proper splinting materials. The man had screamed himself hoarse while Silas held him down, and afterward, Clara's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold her coffee cup. Silas took it from her gently. How do you do it? Stay calm when everything's falling apart? Clara stared into the fire. I don't stay calm, I just don't let it show. Why not? Because the second people see you're scared, they panic, and panic kills faster than most injuries. She flexed her sore fingers. I learned that early. If you want people to trust you, you can't let them see you break. Sounds lonely. It is. The admission surprised her. But it's better than the alternative. Which is? Letting people in, caring about what they think. That's how you get hurt. Clara looked at him. You know that. That's why you're out here alone. Silas didn't deny it. My wife died 3 years ago. Childbed fever. I watched her slip away over 2 days, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do. His voice was flat, emotionless. Afterward, people kept saying she was in a better place, that it was part of some plan, like her dying made sense somehow. It didn't make sense. No, it didn't. He met her eyes. So I stopped listening. Stopped going to town unless I had to. Stopped pretending I was fine when I wasn't. Clara understood. People don't know what to do with grief, so they try to fix it with words that don't mean anything. You sound like you've been through it. Different kind of loss, but loss all the same. Clara pulled her coat tighter. I grew up in an orphanage. Nobody wanted me. Too quiet, too strange, too serious. When I was 16, an old healer took me in as an apprentice. She was the first person who ever looked at me like I was worth something. Her throat tightened. She died 4 years later. Consumption. I tried everything I knew, and it wasn't enough. I'm sorry. Don't be. She taught me that death doesn't care about fairness. It just comes. Clara's voice hardened. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then, is that why you do this? The healing? Part of it. Clara chose her words carefully. The rest is, I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to prove something. To who, I'm not sure anymore. You don't have to prove anything. Tell that to Margaret Dunn. Silas almost smiled. Margaret's scared of you. That's why she's so loud about it. Scared of me? I'm one woman with a bag of herbs and a needle. You're a woman who doesn't need anyone's approval. That terrifies people like her. He stood and added wood to the fire. She spent her whole life building authority through fear and money. You've got authority because people's children stop dying when you walk in the room. She can't buy that, can't bully it, so she tries to tear you down. Clara had never thought about it that way. You're more observant than you let on. Ranch life gives you time to think. Silas settled back in his chair. Too much time, maybe. They fell into comfortable silence after that, and Clara realized something had changed between them. The walls they'd both built were still there, but they'd found a way to talk through them. It was more than she'd had with anyone in years. The turning point came in late January, during the worst cold snap anyone could remember. The temperature dropped so low that trees split open with sounds like gunshots, and livestock froze standing up. Clara was treating a woman for badly frostbitten feet when someone hammered on the door. Silas opened it to find a teenage boy, wild-eyed and breathless. "You gotta come quick," the boy gasped. "There's a family, the Hendersons, trapped in their cabin 5 miles north. Baby's sick, and the father tried to ride for help, but his horse went down. He's been walking for hours." Claire was already grabbing her satchel. "How sick is the baby?" "Don't know. He could barely talk, just kept saying, 'The baby, the baby.'" Silas was pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll get the horses ready." "In this cold?" Clara stared at him. "That's insane." "So is letting a baby die." He was already heading for the barn. "You coming or not?" The ride north was brutal. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, and the snow was deep enough that the horses struggled with every step. Clara's face went numb within minutes, and by the time they were halfway there, she'd lost feeling in her fingers. Silas rode ahead, breaking trail. He didn't speak, saving his energy, but every few minutes he'd glance back to make sure she was still with him. The Henderson cabin was barely visible through the blowing snow. Silas had to hammer on the door 3 times before anyone answered. The father, a man maybe 30 with wild eyes and cracked lips, nearly collapsed when he saw them. "Thank God. Thank God. She won't wake up. The baby won't wake up." Inside, the cabin was freezing. The fire had burned down to embers, and a woman sat in a rocking chair holding a bundle of blankets. She looked up when Clara entered, and her face was a mask of pure terror. "She won't nurse, won't cry. I tried everything." Clara took the baby gently and unwrapped the blankets. The child was maybe 3 months old, and her skin had a bluish tint that Clara recognized immediately. Hypothermia. The baby's core temperature had dropped dangerously low, and her tiny body was shutting down to conserve energy. "Get that fire going," Clara ordered. "Now, as hot as you can get it." Silas was already moving, loading the stove with wood and blowing on the embers. The father stood frozen until Clara snapped, "Help him! Move!" She sat close to the growing fire and tucked the baby inside her own coat, against her skin. The child was so cold she felt like a little ice doll, and Clara's heart sank. This was bad. Worse than bad. "Talk to me," she said to the mother. "When did she stop nursing?" "This morning. Maybe earlier. I don't know." The woman's voice cracked. "I tried to keep her warm, but the fire kept dying, and my husband was gone so long." "It's all right. You did fine." Clara kept her voice calm even as panic clawed at her insides. "I need hot water, not boiling, just warm. And clean cloth." The fire roared now, and the cabin started to warm. Clara worked methodically, warming the baby's extremities slowly. Too fast, and the shock could kill her. She massaged tiny limbs, breathed warm air on cold feet, kept the child tucked against her body heat. Minutes crawled by. Then an hour. The baby didn't respond. "Come on," Clara whispered. "Come on, little one. Fight." Silas had moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor. The parents huddled together on the far side of the room, not speaking, barely breathing. Clara's arms ached from holding the baby so carefully. Her back cramped. And still the child didn't move, didn't cry, didn't show any sign of life. She was about to give up, about to tell these people that she'd failed, that she was sorry, that their daughter was gone. When the baby's tiny chest hitched. It was so small Clara almost missed it. A single shallow breath. Then another. "That's it," Clara breathed. "That's it. Keep going." Color began creeping back into the baby's face. Pink instead of blue. Her eyelids fluttered. And then, finally, she started to cry. The sound was weak and raspy, but it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever heard. The mother sobbed. The father sank to his knees, and Clara just held this tiny life she'd pulled back from the edge, feeling the baby's heartbeat against her chest, strong and steady and alive. Silas's hand came to rest on her shoulder, and when she looked up at him, she saw something in his expression that made her throat tight. Respect. Admiration. Maybe something more. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, but no less brutal. The cold had deepened, and both Clara and Silas were exhausted. They didn't speak until they were almost home, and then Silas said quietly, "You could have died out there." So could that baby. I'm serious. That was reckless. Clara looked at him. You're the one who saddled the horses. I know. He shook his head. We're a hell of a pair, aren't we? I suppose we are. Back at the cabin, they stumbled inside like two people who'd fought a war and barely won. Clara's hands were so cold she couldn't feel them, and Silas had to help her out of her frozen coat. He made coffee while she sat by the fire, trying to remember what warmth felt like. When he handed her a cup, their fingers brushed, and Clara felt something spark in that brief contact. Thank you, she said quietly, for coming with me. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. You could have said no. Told me it was too dangerous, but you didn't. She met his eyes. Why? Silas sat down across from her, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Then, because I've spent 3 years being afraid. Afraid to care, afraid to hope, afraid to let anyone matter again. He looked at her with brutal honesty. But watching you fight for people who've treated you like dirt, I don't know. Made me remember there are things worth being afraid for. Clara didn't know what to say. So she just sat there, holding her coffee, feeling the warmth seep back into her frozen body, and trying to ignore the way her heart had started beating faster. Something had shifted between them, something neither of them was ready to name. But it was there, real and undeniable. And in the morning, when Clara woke to find Silas had already started the fire and left fresh coffee on the stove, she understood that the loneliness she'd carried for so long had finally started to ease. For the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore wasn't alone. And neither was Silas Boone. The peace lasted exactly 3 weeks. Clara should have known better than to trust it, should have recognized that quiet comfort for what it was. Temporary, fragile, bound to shatter the moment someone decided she'd gotten too comfortable. It started with a letter. Henry Polk brought it out to the ranch on a gray February morning, arriving just as Clara was treating a ranch hand for a nasty rope burn. He waited on the porch, stamping his feet against the cold, until she was finished. This came for you? He said, handing her a folded piece of paper. From Silver Creek. Clara's stomach dropped. She recognized the handwriting before she even opened it. Sharp, angular letters written by someone who'd never learned to hold a pen gently. Bad news? Silas asked from the doorway. Clara read the letter twice, then crumpled it in her fist. Someone asking about my past. What kind of asking? The bad kind. She looked at Henry, who was trying very hard to appear disinterested. Who else has seen this? Henry shifted uncomfortably. It came through the general store, can't say who might have noticed. Which meant everyone had noticed. Of course they had. After Henry left, Clara showed Silas the letter. It was from a woman named Ruth Calhoun, claiming to be writing on behalf of the Silver Creek community. The words were polite enough, but the threat underneath was clear. We heard you're practicing medicine in Briar Ridge. Thought they should know what happened here. Thought they deserved the truth about what you did. What did you do? Silas asked quietly. Clara walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered hills. A woman died during childbirth. I tried to save her, and I failed. That's it? That's enough. Her voice was bitter. In Silver Creek, it was enough to run me out of town. Silas was silent for a moment. Then, tell me what really happened. So Clara did. She told him about arriving in Silver Creek 2 years ago, about the pregnant woman named Elizabeth Marsh, who'd waited too long to ask for help, about the baby that was breech and the mother who was already bleeding internally by the time Clara got there. I stayed with her for 16 hours, Clara said, her voice hollow. Tried everything I knew. The baby was already dead, had been for days probably, but Elizabeth kept begging me to save it, kept saying her husband would never forgive her if she lost another child. She closed her eyes. She died just before dawn, and her husband came home to find me covered in his wife's blood, and he decided I'd killed her. Had you? Clara flinched. I don't know. Maybe if I'd been better trained, faster, smarter. Maybe if I'd... That's not what I asked. Silas moved closer. Did you do something wrong? Make a mistake that killed her? I couldn't save her. That's different than killing her. Not to the people in Silver Creek, not to her family. Clara turned to face him. They wanted someone to blame, and I was convenient, so I left before they could do more than threaten. Silas studied her face. You've been carrying that around for 2 years? Longer. There are others. A child with scarlet fever in Ellsworth, an old man with heart failure in Weston Creek. Her voice cracked. People die, Silas, no matter how hard you fight, and every single time there's someone who thinks it's your fault. She expected judgment, expected him to step back, see her differently, realize she wasn't worth defending. Instead, Silas said, "I'm sorry that happened to you, but it doesn't change anything. It will when everyone in Briar Ridge hears about it. Let them hear. Anyone with sense will know the difference between failing to save someone and causing their death." He paused. And anyone without sense wasn't going to trust you anyway. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd lived through this enough times to know how it would play out. The rumors started the next day. Clara heard them in fragments, pieces carried back by the people who still came to her for help. Margaret Dunn had gotten hold of the story somehow, probably through Henry Polk's wife, who couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it, and she was telling anyone who would listen. A woman died under her care. She let a mother and baby die rather than admit she didn't know what she was doing. She's a fraud who's been running from town to town, leaving bodies behind. None of it was exactly true, but none of it was exactly false either, and that made it impossible to fight. Within a week, the flow of patients slowed to a trickle. Families who'd been grateful for Clara's help suddenly found excuses not to visit. Mothers pulled their children away when she walked through town, and the whispers followed her everywhere. Clara tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the work, on the few people who still trusted her. But the isolation was crushing in a way it had never been before. Because this time, she'd started to believe she could stay, started to imagine a future in Briar Ridge that didn't involve running. And now that future was crumbling like everything else always did. Silas noticed. Of course he noticed. "You're quiet," he said one night over dinner. "I'm always quiet. Different kind of quiet." He set down his fork. "Talk to me." Clara pushed food around her plate. "There's nothing to say. This is how it goes. People hear stories, decide I'm dangerous, stop trusting me. Eventually it gets bad enough that I leave." She met his eyes. "I should probably start planning where to go next." "You're not leaving." "Silas, I mean it." His voice was firm. "You haven't done anything wrong. You're not running because some bitter woman is spreading lies." "They're not lies. Not entirely." Clara's throat tightened. "That woman did die, and I couldn't save her. Maybe if I'd been better—" "Stop." Silas reached across the table and caught her hand. "You can't save everyone. No one can, and punishing yourself for being human doesn't change that." Clara stared at their joined hands. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. "Why do you care? You barely know me." "I know enough." He didn't let go. "I know you rode into a blizzard to save a baby. I know you've treated half this county without asking for payment. I know you're one of the strongest people I've ever met, even if you can't see it yourself." Something broke open in Clara's chest. She pulled her hand back, but gently. "Strength doesn't matter if everyone thinks you're a murderer." "Then we change what they think." "How?" Silas stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "By not hiding. By making sure everyone in this town sees exactly who you are and what you're doing." He grabbed his coat. "Next time someone needs help, I'm coming with you. They want to judge you? They can do it while watching you save their neighbors." Clara stared at him. "That's your plan? Just be visible?" "You have a better one?" She didn't, and the fact that Silas was willing to stake his own reputation on hers made her want to cry and scream at the same time. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know." Silas pulled on his coat, "but I'm going to anyway." The first test came 2 days later when a boy showed up at the ranch saying his sister was having trouble breathing. Clara grabbed her satchel, and Silas grabbed his coat without being asked. They rode into town together in the middle of the afternoon when Main Street was full of people. Heads turned, whispers started. Margaret Dunn stood outside the general store with her arms crossed and her face set in hard lines. Clara felt every eye on her as she dismounted, felt the weight of their judgment, their suspicion, their fear. But Silas was right beside her, and when he offered his arm, she took it. They walked into the boarding house together, and Margaret couldn't stop them without making a scene. The girl was 9 years old with croup so bad she could barely draw breath. Clara worked quickly, setting up a steam tent and preparing a tincture to ease the swelling in her throat. The girl's mother hovered anxiously, and Clara could see the internal battle playing out on her face. Desperate for help, but terrified of trusting the wrong person. "She's going to be fine," Clara said, keeping her voice calm. "The steam will help her breathe, and the medicine will bring down the inflammation. By tomorrow, she'll be much better." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "People are saying terrible things about you." "I know. Are they true?" Clara met her gaze directly. "A woman died while I was treating her. That's true. I tried to save her and failed. Also true. But I didn't kill her, and I didn't run away because I felt guilty. I left because her family blamed me for something I couldn't prevent." She paused. "If you don't trust me, I understand. But your daughter needs help now, and I'm the only one here who can give it." The mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right. Tell me what to do." By the time Clara and Silas left, the girl was breathing easier, and the mother was crying with relief. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, people pretending to be busy while obviously waiting to see what would happen. Margaret Dunn stepped into their path. "Convenient," she said loudly. "The child gets sick right when you need to prove yourself." Clara stopped. Silas's hand tightened on her arm, but she gently pulled away. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Mrs. Dunn?" "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm simply observing that people seem to have a lot of medical emergencies around you." "That's because I'm a healer. People come to me when they're sick or hurt. That's how it works. Or maybe you're making them sick so you can play the hero." Margaret's smile was cruel. "Wouldn't be the first time someone used tragedy to their advantage." The crowd murmured. Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and sharp and dangerous. But she kept her voice level. "If you have proof of that, present it. Otherwise, you're just spreading vicious lies about someone who's done nothing but help this town." "Help? You let a woman die?" "I tried to save a woman who was already dying. There's a difference." Clara took a step forward, and Margaret actually backed up. "I've delivered babies, set bones, treated infections, and saved lives in this town. What have you done besides tear people down to make yourself feel important?" Margaret's face went red. "How dare you?" "I dare because I'm tired of listening to you." Clara's voice was quiet, but carried across the street. "You called me a fraud before you even met me. You've spread rumors, turned people against me, and done everything in your power to drive me out. And why? Because you're threatened by someone who doesn't need your approval to exist." Silas was watching her with something like awe. The crowd had gone silent. Margaret sputtered, You can't. This is outrageous." "What's outrageous is letting your pride matter more than people's lives." Clara turned to address the crowd. "I'm not perfect. I failed to save people, and I'll probably fail again. But I've never lied about what I can do, never taken advantage of desperate people, and never pretended to be something I'm not. If that's not good enough for this town, then fine, I'll leave. But I won't do it because of lies and gossip." She turned and walked toward the wagon. Silas followed without a word, and they rode out of town in absolute silence. 3 blocks away, Clara's hands started shaking. By the time they reached the ranch, she was trembling so badly she could barely dismount. "I can't believe I just did that," she whispered. Silas helped her down. "I can. I made everything worse. Now everyone will know you're not going to be pushed around." He steadied her when her legs nearly gave out. "That took guts. That took stupidity. Margaret Dunn runs this town. I just declared war on her." "Good, because she declared war on you first." Silas guided her toward the cabin. "And for what it's worth, I think you won." Clara wasn't so sure. But that night, when she couldn't sleep, she heard Silas moving around in the main room. And when she finally gave up and went out there, she found him sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Clara sat down in the other chair. "Keeps replaying in my head. All the things I should have said differently." "You said it perfectly. I called her out in front of half the town. She deserved it." Silas handed her his coffee, and she took it gratefully. "You've been letting people walk over you since you got here. About time you stood up. And if it backfires? If everyone turns against me? Then we deal with it." He met her eyes. Together. That word, together, settled into Clara's chest like warmth. She'd been alone for so long that the idea of someone standing beside her felt foreign. Dangerous, even. Because what happened when he changed his mind? When he realized she wasn't worth the trouble? But looking at Silas now, At the steady certainty in his expression, Clara wanted to believe, wanted to trust that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today. For all of it." "Stop thanking me. I'm not doing you a favor." Silas's voice was rough. "I'm doing what's right. There's a difference." They sat in silence after that, passing the coffee back and forth, watching the fire burn low. And when Clara finally went back to bed, she slept better than she had in weeks. But the next morning brought new problems. A man showed up at the ranch before dawn, pounding on the door hard enough to wake the dead. Silas answered it with his rifle in hand, and Clara was right behind him with her satchel. "It's my boy," the man gasped. He was one of the mill workers. Clara recognized him but didn't know his name. "He's been coughing for days and now he's coughing up blood. Please." They rode back to town at a gallop. The boy was 12, pale as death, with bright red blood staining his lips and chin. Clara examined him quickly and felt her heart sink. Tuberculosis. Advanced stage, judging by the blood and the sound of his lungs. There was almost nothing she could do, no cure, no miracle treatment, just palliative care to ease the suffering and maybe buy him a few more weeks. But she tried anyway. Made tinctures to ease the coughing, prepared poultices for his chest, showed the family how to keep him comfortable. The boy's mother clung to every word like Clara was offering hope instead of just slightly delayed death. "He'll get better, won't he?" the mother asked desperately. "You can save him?" Clara wanted to lie, wanted to give this woman the comfort of false hope, but she'd never been good at lying. "I can make him more comfortable, help him breathe easier. But this disease," she chose her words carefully, "it's very serious. I'll do everything I can, but you should prepare yourself." The mother's face crumpled. No, you have to save him. You saved Tommy Breslin's hand and the Henderson baby. And this is different." Clara's throat was tight. "I'm sorry. I wish I could promise you more." She left instructions and promised to come back the next day. But when she and Silas rode away, she could feel the weight of that mother's desperation pressing down on her shoulders. "You did everything you could," Silas said quietly. "It won't be enough." "Maybe not, but that doesn't make it your fault." Clara wanted to believe him, but she knew how this would end. The boy would die, the family would blame her, and every doubt Margaret Dunn had planted would bloom into certainty. She was right. The boy lasted 4 days. Clara visited every day, adjusting his medicines, trying to ease his suffering. But tuberculosis didn't care about herbs and tinctures. It ate through his lungs until he drowned in his own blood, and there was nothing Clara could do but hold his hand while he died. The mother screamed at her, called her useless, incompetent, a fraud who'd let her son die. And Clara stood there and took it because what else could she do? The woman had just lost her child. She deserved to rage. But the damage was done. By the next morning, the story had spread through Briar Ridge like wildfire. Clara Whitmore had failed again. Another person dead under her care. Maybe Margaret Dunn was right. Maybe the woman was dangerous. The patients stopped coming entirely. Even the people who'd been grateful before now crossed the street to avoid her. And when Clara went into town for supplies, the hostility was so thick she could taste it. Silas tried to shield her from the worst of it, but he couldn't stop the whispers or the looks. And Clara could see it wearing on him too, the way people avoided him now, the way conversations died when he entered a room. "I'm poisoning your reputation," she said one night. "I don't care about my reputation." "You should. This is your home. These are your neighbors." "They're being idiots." Silas's voice was hard. "That boy was dying before you ever touched him. Anyone with eyes could see that." "Doesn't matter. People see what they want to see." Clara stared into the fire. "I should leave. This isn't fair to you." "Don't." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "Don't run because they're too ignorant to know better." "I'm not running. I'm being practical." But even as she said it, Clara knew it was a lie. She was absolutely running, just like she always did. Silas stood abruptly. "I'm going to check the barn." He left, and Clara sat alone in the silence, feeling the familiar weight of failure pressing down on her chest. She'd tried so hard to make this work, tried to prove herself, build a life, be more than just the wandering healer nobody trusted. But it didn't matter, because this was how it always ended, with accusations and anger and the slow realization that she'd never be good enough. She was packing her satchel when Silas came back. "What are you doing?" His voice was flat. "What I should have done weeks ago." Clara didn't look at him. "There's a supply wagon heading east in 2 days. I can be on it." "So that's it? You're just giving up?" "I'm not giving up. I'm accepting reality." She finally met his eyes. "I can't help people who don't want my help, and I can't keep dragging you down with me." Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. "You're not dragging me anywhere. I chose to stand with you. That was my decision. And now you can choose differently." "I don't want to choose differently." His hands clenched into fists. "I want you to stay and fight." "I'm tired of fighting," Clara said, and her voice broke. "I'm tired of proving myself over and over just to have it fall apart. I'm tired of caring about people who'll never trust me. I'm just tired." Silas stared at her, and she saw the moment he understood, really understood, that this wasn't about Briar Ridge or Margaret Dunn or one dead boy. This was about years of carrying weight that should have broken her long ago. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Then rest. You don't have to leave to do that. If I stay, it'll just get worse. Maybe, or maybe it'll get better." He sat down across from her. "I can't promise this town will come around. Can't promise Margaret will stop spreading poison, but I can promise that you won't face it alone." Clara closed her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," Silas stopped, started again. "Because somewhere in the last 3 months, you became important to me, and I'm not ready to lose that." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. "Silas, you don't have to say anything. Just don't leave yet. Give it a little more time." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why staying was foolish, why getting attached to this place, to him, was only going to make the inevitable leaving harder. But when she looked at him, at this quiet, stubborn man who'd defended her when no one else would, she found herself nodding. "1 more week," she said. "But if things don't change, they will." Silas's certainty was absolute. They have to. Clara wished she could believe him, but she'd lived too long, seen too much, to trust in things changing. Still, 1 more week wouldn't kill her, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The weeks stretched ahead of Clara like a prison sentence she'd volunteered for. She woke each morning expecting someone to arrive needing help, but the ranch stayed quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that came from being deliberately avoided. On the 3rd day, Silas rode into town and came back with news that made Clara's stomach turn. "Doc Brennan sent word from Sacramento," he said, hanging up his coat. "He's not coming back. Got a position at a hospital there and sold his practice to some businessman from Denver." Clara set down the bread she'd been kneading. When were they planning to tell people? "They just did. Posted a notice at the general store this morning." Silas's expression was grim. "You're it, Clara. You're the only medical help this town has. They'd rather die than let me touch them." "We'll see about that." Clara wanted to ask what he meant, but Silas had already headed back outside to finish his work. She watched through the window as he repaired a section of fence, his movements efficient and methodical, and wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Because it sure as hell wasn't what she saw. A woman who'd failed more times than she'd succeeded, who couldn't save the people who needed her most, who'd never be good enough no matter how hard she tried. The breaking point came on the 4th day. It started with a scream. Clara was outside hanging laundry when she heard it, thin and high and terrified, coming from the direction of town. Silas dropped the post he was setting, and they both ran for the horses. They found chaos on Main Street, people running, shouting, pointing toward the schoolhouse. And through it all, that awful screaming continued. Clara pushed through the crowd and found a nightmare. The schoolhouse stove had exploded. That's what people were saying anyway. Something about the flue being blocked and pressure building until the cast iron door blew off like a cannon shot. 3 children had been close enough to get hit by flying debris and scalding water. The teacher, a young woman barely 20, stood frozen in the doorway with blood running down her face and her hands pressed to her mouth. Clara grabbed her. "How many hurt?" 3, maybe 4. I don't know. "Focus! Where are they?" The teacher pointed inside with a shaking hand. Clara ran in with Silas right behind her. 2 boys lay on the floor near the ruined stove. One was conscious and screaming, clutching his arm where the skin had been seared away. The other wasn't moving. Across the room, a little girl sat against the wall with her dress soaked in blood from a gash across her forehead. Clara's mind went cold and clear the way it always did in emergencies. She pointed at the conscious boy. "Silas, get him outside. Cold water on the burn now." She moved to the unconscious child and pressed her fingers to his neck. Pulse. Weak, but there. She rolled him carefully and found a massive bruise forming on the back of his skull where he'd been thrown against the wall. "Someone get me clean cloth," Clara shouted, "and water, and my satchel from the horse." No one moved. Clara looked up and found a dozen people staring at her from the doorway. Frozen. Terrified. Waiting for someone to tell them what to do. "Now!" she roared, and the spell broke. People scattered. Someone brought her satchel. Someone else started pumping water, and Clara worked. She stabilized the unconscious boy first, checking his pupils, feeling for broken bones, making sure he could breathe. Then she moved to the girl with the head wound, cleaning and closing it with quick, precise stitches while the child sobbed. Outside, she could hear Silas talking the burned boy through his pain in a low, steady voice. More children were hurt, minor injuries mostly. Burns, cuts, bruises. Clara treated them one by one, her hands moving automatically while her mind stayed focused on the two serious cases. The unconscious boy woke up halfway through, confused and crying for his mother. Clara checked him for signs of brain injury and found nothing obvious, but she knew head trauma was unpredictable. He'd need watching. By the time she finished, 2 hours had passed and Clara was covered in blood and soot. Her hands ached. Her back screamed, but all the children were stable. She stepped outside into afternoon sunlight and found half the town gathered in the street. Silas was there, his shirt soaked from helping with the burns. When he saw her, something in his expression shifted. "They're okay? For now. The boy who hit his head needs monitoring. The burns are serious but manageable if they're kept clean." Clara wiped her forehead and realized her hands were shaking. "Where are the parents?" "Right here." A man pushed through the crowd, one of the mill workers Clara vaguely recognized. His face was white. "My son, Thomas. He's the one who... Head injury. He's awake and talking, which is good. But you need to watch him closely. If he starts vomiting, or can't stay awake, or seems confused, come find me immediately." The man nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. I don't know how to... Thank you." He disappeared into the schoolhouse. Other parents followed, collecting their injured children, some crying, some too shocked to speak. Clara stood there feeling her adrenaline drain away, leaving nothing but exhaustion. She wanted to sit down, wanted to close her eyes, wanted... "You saved them." Clara turned. The voice belonged to Sarah Fletcher, the general store owner's wife, the woman who'd been one of the first to turn away when the rumors started. "I did my job," Clara said flatly. "You did more than that," Sarah's voice cracked. "My niece, the little girl with the cut, you could have let her scar. Could have done a quick job and walked away. But you took your time. Made it neat." She wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry for believing the gossip, for avoiding you. You didn't deserve that." Clara didn't know what to say. Apologies always felt hollow after the damage was done. But before she could respond, another voice spoke up. "She's right. It was Thomas Breslin's father, the mill worker whose son had nearly lost his hand months ago. My boy still has his hand because of you, still has his fingers, his grip. He's back at work now." He looked around at the crowd. "We've all been fools, listening to lies instead of watching what was right in front of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Clara felt something twist in her chest. This was what she'd wanted: recognition, acceptance, proof that she belonged. But it felt wrong somehow, like it had taken a disaster to make them see her as human. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "But I need to check on those children. Make sure..." "Clara." She froze. That voice was unmistakable. Margaret Dunn pushed through the crowd, and Clara braced herself for another confrontation. But when Margaret stopped in front of her, the woman's face held something Clara had never seen before. Fear. "My nephew," Margaret said, and her voice shook. "He's one of the boys with burns. He's at my sister's house, and he can't breathe right. There's something wrong with his chest, and..." She stopped, swallowed hard. "Please, I know I've been awful to you. I know I don't deserve to ask, But he's just a child and he's scared and take me to him, Clara said. Relief flooded Margaret's face. Thank you. Thank you. Save it. Just take me to him. Margaret's house was 3 blocks away. The boy, maybe 8 years old, lay on a bed wheezing like each breath was a battle. His mother hovered nearby, crying quietly. Clara examined him quickly. His burns were on his chest and shoulders, painful but not life-threatening. What worried her was his breathing, labored, rapid, with a crackling sound that suggested his lungs were filling with fluid. Smoke inhalation. The superheated air from the explosion had damaged his airways. I need to sit him up, Clara said. Props behind his back, and I need steam. Boil water. Get it going now. Margaret ran to follow instructions while Clara worked. She made a poultice for the burns, prepared a tincture to ease the breathing, and monitored every rasping breath the boy took. Silas had followed them. He stood in the doorway watching as Clara fought to keep this child's airways open. And when the boy's breathing got so bad that his lips started turning blue, Clara did the only thing she could think of. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and breathed air directly into his lungs. Margaret gasped. The boy's mother made a choking sound. But it worked. The boy's chest rose and fell, and color started returning to his face. Clara did it again, and again, until finally the boy coughed and started breathing on his own, weak but steady. Keep the steam going, Clara instructed, her voice hoarse. It'll help loosen everything in his chest. The tincture every 2 hours. And watch him. If his breathing gets worse, I'll come find you, Margaret finished. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I was wrong about you. So wrong. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clara looked at this woman who'd made her life hell for months, who'd called her a fraud, spread vicious rumors, turned the whole town against her, and she felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just bone-deep exhaustion. Your nephew is sick, Clara said quietly. Focus on that. We can deal with the rest later. She left before Margaret could respond. Outside, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. Clara climbed onto Silas's wagon and sat there staring at nothing while he drove them home. They were halfway back to the ranch when the snow started. It wasn't the gentle, drifting snow of early winter. This was something else. Something worse. The flakes came down thick and fast, driven by wind that cut like knives. Within minutes, visibility dropped to almost nothing. We need to get back, Silas said, urging the horses faster. But the storm had other plans. It hit with terrifying speed. One moment they could see the road. The next, everything was white. The horses balked, refusing to move forward into the blinding wall of snow. We're not going to make it, Clara said, but the Hendersons' place is closer. We can shelter there. They turned the wagon and pushed forward, fighting the wind. Clara's face went numb. Her hands locked around the seat to keep from being thrown off. And still the snow fell harder, piling up so fast it was like the sky itself was collapsing. They found the Henderson cabin more by luck than navigation. Silas pounded on the door while Clara helped him unhitch the terrified horses. Mr. Henderson opened the door, took one look at the storm, and pulled them inside. Jesus, that came out of nowhere. Blizzard, Silas said, brushing snow from his coat. Going to be a bad one. He was right. By the time they got the horses into the Henderson small barn, the wind was howling like a living thing, and the snow was already knee-deep. They spent the night in the Henderson cabin, crowded around the fire with the family while the storm raged outside. Clara checked on the baby she'd saved weeks ago, healthy and growing, thank heaven, and tried to ignore the way Mr. Henderson kept looking at her. You're the healer, he finally said, the one Margaret Dunn's been talking about. Clara braced herself. That's me. She said you were dangerous, said people died under your care. They did. Clara met his eyes. I've failed to save people. I'll probably fail again, but I've never lied about what I can do, and I've never stopped trying. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. Then he looked at his baby daughter sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. That little girl wouldn't be here without you. Neither would half the children in this county. He held out his hand. Whatever Margaret says, you're welcome in this house. Clara shook his hand and something in her chest loosened slightly. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days trapped in a cabin barely big enough for the Henderson family, let alone 2 extra people. 3 days of wind that threatened to tear the roof off and snow that piled higher than the windows. 3 days of wondering if they'd all freeze to death or starve before it ended. But they survived. Clara helped Mrs. Henderson cook, entertained the children with stories from her travels, and tried not to think about what was happening in Briar Ridge. Because storms like this didn't just trap people, they killed them. And somewhere out there, people were dying, getting hurt, needing help that wasn't coming. On the second night, when the children were asleep and the adults sat around the dying fire, Silas moved to sit beside Clara. "You're thinking about the town," he said quietly. "Hard not to. They'll manage." "Will they?" Clara stared at the embers. "Margaret's nephew, the boy with the head injury. All those burns that need tending." Her voice dropped. "What if they need me and I'm not there?" "Then they'll do the best they can, same as everyone else." Silas's shoulder pressed against hers. "You can't save the whole world, Clara." "I know that, but I should be able to save the people right in front of me." "You do. Every single day." He paused. "You just don't give yourself credit for it." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. They'd been living under the same roof for months now, but it occurred to her that she'd been so focused on survival that she'd never really seen him, never noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, or how he always positioned himself between her and potential threats, or the fact that he'd been quietly defending her since the day they met. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "About me, I mean. You could have just offered me a room and left it at that. But you've stood beside me through everything." Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Because watching you fight, watching you refuse to break no matter what they throw at you, reminded me what courage looks like." He met her eyes. "I'd forgotten. After my wife died, I just stopped. Stopped hoping, stopped trying, stopped caring about anything except getting through each day. Then you showed up, and I saw someone who'd been beaten down 100 times and still got back up." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm not that strong." "Yes, you are. You just can't see it." He hesitated then, and somewhere along the way, keeping you safe started mattering more than anything else. The words hung in the cold air between them. Clara's heart hammered so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Silas, you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." He stood, moving back to his bedroll on the far side of the room. "Get some sleep. Storm should break tomorrow." But Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind howl and thinking about what he'd said. About caring. About mattering. About the fact that this quiet, stubborn man had somehow become the most important person in her life without her noticing. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. They dug their way out of the Henderson cabin to find a world transformed. Snow everywhere, piled higher than Clara had ever seen. Trees bent nearly double, and an eerie crystalline silence that came after nature had exhausted itself. The ride back to town took hours. The horses struggled through drifts that came up to their chests. Twice they had to stop and dig out the wagon. But eventually, Briar Ridge appeared through the white landscape. The town looked like it had been hit by a war. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow. The mill's smokestack had toppled. Fences were buried, and everywhere people were digging out, looking dazed and exhausted. But they were alive. Silas pulled the wagon up to the general store, and before Clara could climb down, Sarah Fletcher burst out the door. "Thank heavens you're here. We've been hit hard. Broken bones, frostbite, 2 roofs collapsed with people inside. And Margaret's nephew, his breathing got bad again last night, and she's been asking for you." Clara was already grabbing her satchel. "Show me the worst cases first." What followed was the longest 48 hours of Clara's life. She treated frostbite so severe that one man lost 3 toes, set a broken leg that had been splinted wrong and started healing crooked, delivered a baby 2 months early, premature and tiny and fighting for every breath. And through it all, people kept coming, kept asking for help, kept trusting her with their lives. Margaret's nephew was stable but still struggling. Clara visited him 4 times a day, adjusting his treatments, monitoring his breathing. Margaret watched everything with haunted eyes, and twice Clara caught her crying. On the 3rd visit, Margaret stopped Clara at the door. "I need to apologize, properly." Her voice shook. "I was cruel to you, vicious, and I did it because—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "Because you reminded me of someone, my husband's mistress. Before he died, he'd been seeing a woman who called herself a spiritual healer. She took his money, fed his drinking, and when he finally died, she disappeared with everything he'd promised her." Margaret's eyes were red. When you showed up, I saw her. Saw another woman using people's desperation to take advantage. But I was wrong. You're nothing like her. Mrozki, Clara didn't know what to say. The apology felt real, but it didn't erase months of pain. Your nephew is getting better, she said finally. That's what matters. Is it? Margaret met her eyes. I nearly drove you out of town. Nearly cost these people the only healer they have. What if you'd left? What if you weren't here when the storm hit? But I was here. Because Silas Boone convinced you to stay. Not because of anything I did. Margaret's voice cracked. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. Clara looked at this broken woman and felt something shift. We've all been wrong about something. All made judgments we regret. She paused. What matters is what we do next. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. What can I do? To help? Keep your nephew's room warm. Keep the steam going. And if you hear of anyone else who needs help, send them to me. Clara shouldered her satchel. That's all I ask. The work didn't stop. Day bled into night, bled into day again. Clara treated injuries, delivered medicine, showed people how to care for their sick, and slowly something in Briar Ridge began to change. People started referring to her as the doc, not that healer or the woman staying at Boone's place, just the doc. When Clara walked down Main Street, people nodded, said hello, asked how she was holding up. And one evening, when Clara finally returned to the ranch so exhausted she could barely stand, she found Silas waiting on the porch. How bad? He asked. Bad, but manageable. Clara sank onto the steps beside him. Everyone's going to make it, I think. Because of you. Because people are tougher than they look. She leaned back against the post. I'm so tired, Silas. I don't think I've ever been this tired. Then rest. He stood and held out his hand. Come inside. I'll make dinner. Clara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. But when she should have let go, she didn't, and neither did he. They stood there in the cold twilight, hands clasped, and Clara realized with sudden clarity that this was what she'd been missing all her life. Not acceptance from a town, not recognition for her work. This. Someone who saw her, really saw her, and chose to stay anyway. Silas, she started, but before she could continue, hoofbeats sounded on the road. They turned to see a rider approaching fast. It was Sarah Fletcher's husband, and his face was white with panic. It's my daughter, he gasped. She's burning up with fever, and she's having some kind of fit. Please, you have to come now. Clara was moving before she finished processing his words, grabbed her satchel, mounted her horse, and rode into the night one more time. Because this was who she was. This was what she did. She saved people, or died trying. And if that meant she never got to finish what she'd been about to say to Silas, then that was the price she'd pay. Some things were worth more than words anyway. The Fletcher girl had scarlet fever. Clara knew it the moment she saw the rash spreading across the child's chest. Tiny red dots that looked like someone had scattered poppy seeds under her skin. The fever, the convulsions, the way her throat had swollen nearly shut. All of it pointed to the same terrifying diagnosis. How long has she been like this? Clara asked, already preparing a cold compress. Sarah Fletcher's voice shook. She complained of a sore throat yesterday. By this morning, she couldn't swallow. Then the fever spiked and she started. Her voice broke. Is she going to die? Clara wanted to lie. Wanted to offer comfortable reassurances that everything would be fine. But she'd learned long ago that false hope was crueler than hard truth. I don't know, she said, meeting Sarah's eyes. Scarlet fever kills children. But I've treated it before and some of them lived. I'll do everything I can. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Behind Clara, Silas stood in the doorway, and she could feel him watching, waiting, ready to help however she needed. The next 12 hours were brutal. Clara fought the fever with cold baths that made the girl scream, forced liquids down her swollen throat, applied poultices to bring down the inflammation. And when the child's breathing got so labored that her lips turned blue, Clara used a thin tube to bypass the swollen tissue and get air into her lungs. It was desperate, dangerous. The kind of procedure that could kill just as easily as save. But it worked. By dawn, the girl's fever had broken. Her breathing eased. The rash began to fade, and when she opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama," Sarah collapsed sobbing beside the bed. Clara packed her instruments with hands that shook from exhaustion. She'd been awake for nearly 40 hours straight, and her body was starting to shut down. "You should rest," Silas said quietly. He'd stayed the whole night, fetching water and supplies, keeping the fire going, making sure Clara ate something even when she insisted she was fine. "I need to check on Margaret's nephew, and the Henderson baby, and Clara." Silas caught her arm gently. "You're dead on your feet. The rest can wait an hour. People don't wait. Illness doesn't wait. And you're no good to anyone if you collapse." His voice was firm but kind. 1 hour. That's all I'm asking." Clara wanted to argue, but the room tilted dangerously, and she had to grip the table to stay upright. Maybe he was right. Maybe she did need to rest. They rode back to the ranch in the cold February dawn. The world was still buried in snow, but the sun was out, and the air had that brittle clarity that came after a storm. Clara dozed against Silas's shoulder, too tired to care about propriety. At the cabin, Silas guided her inside and toward her room. "Sleep. I'll handle anything that comes up." "You're not a healer." "No, but I can tell people to come back in a few hours." He pulled a blanket over her. "Rest, Clara. You've earned it." She wanted to protest, wanted to insist she was fine, but exhaustion dragged her under like a riptide, and she was asleep before Silas even left the room. When Clara woke, the sun was setting. She'd slept for 10 hours. She stumbled out of her room to find Silas cooking dinner and looking remarkably unconcerned. "Did anyone come?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "3 people. Told them you'd been up all night saving the Fletcher girl, and they could wait until tomorrow unless someone was dying." He glanced at her. They waited. Clara should have been angry, should have insisted on seeing them immediately, but all she felt was gratitude that someone had given her permission to be human for a few hours. "Thank you," she said quietly. Silas set a plate in front of her. "Stop thanking me for basic decency." They ate in comfortable silence, and Clara realized how much had shifted in the past few weeks. How this cabin had stopped feeling like temporary shelter and started feeling like home. How Silas's presence had become as necessary as breathing. How terrifying that was. "I need to tell you something," she said, setting down her fork. Silas looked up. "All right. Before the storm, when you told me that I mattered to you," Clara's throat felt tight. "I didn't know what to say. I still don't. But I keep thinking about it, and I need you to understand something. You don't have to explain." "Yes, I do." Clara met his eyes. "I've spent my whole life believing I wasn't allowed to have things, wasn't allowed to want them, because every time I let myself care about something, it got taken away. My home, my teacher, every town I tried to settle in, everything." Her voice cracked. "So when you said I mattered, part of me wanted to run, because caring about you, letting you matter to me, feels like setting myself up for more loss." Silas was very still. "And the other part of you?" "The other part wants to stay, wants to believe that maybe this time could be different." She looked down at her hands. "But I don't know how to do that. How to trust that this won't fall apart like everything else." Silas stood and moved around the table. He crouched beside her chair so they were eye level. "I can't promise it won't fall apart," he said quietly. "Can't promise we won't hurt each other, or that things won't get hard. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere." He took her hand. "You matter to me, Clara, not because of what you do or how useful you are, just because you're you. And that's not going to change." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've spent 3 years being sure I'd never feel anything again. And then you showed up and proved me wrong." He smiled slightly. "If you can break through that much grief and stubbornness, I figure you're pretty well stuck with me." Clara laughed despite the tears starting to fall. "That's a terrible promise." "It's the best I've got." Silas wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Is it enough?" Clara looked at this man who'd defended her when no one else would, who'd ridden into blizzards and stood beside her through every failure and success. Who saw past her armor to the broken, scared woman underneath and chose to stay anyway. "Yeah," she whispered, "it's enough." Silas leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he kissed her, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. Clara kissed him back and felt something inside her chest crack open. All the walls she'd built, all the defenses she'd maintained for years, crumbling under the weight of this one simple truth. She wasn't alone anymore. When they finally pulled apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said. "Not as a trial. Not as an arrangement. Just stay." "I'm scared," Clara admitted. "Me too," he smiled. "But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of trying." Clara took a shaky breath. "Okay, I'll stay." The words hung in the air between them, a promise, a commitment, a leap of faith that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, wrapped in Silas's arms, Clara felt warmer than she had in years. The town's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Word spread about the Fletcher girl's recovery, about how Clara had worked through the night to save her, about the dozens of people she'd treated during and after the blizzard without asking for payment or recognition. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Briar Ridge began to change its mind. People started nodding to Clara on the street. The general store owner gave her discounts without being asked. Someone left a basket of preserves on the ranch porch with a note that just said, "Thank you." Margaret Dunn, still chastened by how close she'd come to losing her nephew, made a point of greeting Clara publicly whenever they crossed paths. It was awkward and stilted, but it was something. "The town council wants to meet with you," Silas told Clara one morning in early March. The snow was finally starting to melt, leaving the world muddy and raw. Clara looked up from the medical supply list she was writing. "About what?" "They want to make you the official town physician, offer you Doc Brennan's old office on Main Street." Clara's heart jumped. "They want to pay me?" "Room and board plus a stipend. Not much, but steady." Silas sat across from her. "You don't have to decide now. Think about it." But Clara was already thinking. About having a real office instead of treating people in spare rooms and kitchens. About not having to worry where the next meal was coming from. About building something permanent instead of always being ready to run. "What do you think?" she asked. Silas considered the question. "I think you've earned it 10 times over. But I also think you need to decide what you want. Not what the town wants. Not what I want. What you want." Clara looked around the cabin, at the fire burning low in the hearth, at the coffee cups they'd left on the table, at all the small signs of the life they were building together. Then she looked at Silas, at this man who'd become her anchor in ways she was still learning to understand. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to build something real here, with you, with this town." She paused. "But on my terms. I'm not going to pretend to be perfect or stop speaking my mind. If they want me, they get all of me, the good and the difficult." Silas smiled. "I wouldn't want it any other way." The meeting with the town council was scheduled for the following week. Clara spent the intervening days treating patients, checking on recoveries, and trying not to think about how much this opportunity meant to her. The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything that could go wrong. They could change their minds, could decide she wasn't respectable enough, could... A soft knock on her door interrupted the spiral of anxiety. "You awake?" Silas's voice was quiet. "Yeah." He opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Heard you moving around. Figured you were overthinking." "I don't overthink." "You absolutely overthink." He moved to sit on the edge of her bed. "Talk to me." Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "What if they change their minds? What if someone objects and the whole thing falls apart? Then we deal with it, same as we've dealt with everything else." Silas's voice was calm. "But Clara, you need to understand something. This town needs you, not the other way around. You could walk away tomorrow and find work in a dozen other places, but they'd be left with no medical care and the knowledge that they nearly drove away the best healer this county's ever seen. You're biased, completely. Doesn't make it less true." He took her hand. "Stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sometimes things just work out." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that maybe, finally, she'd found a place where she belonged. "What if I'm not good enough?" she whispered. Silas looked at her with such fierce certainty that it took her breath away. "You saved my life, Clara. Not literally, nothing that dramatic. But I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and you pulled me out without even trying. You reminded me what living looks like, what fighting for something looks like." His voice roughened. If that's not good enough, I don't know what is. Clara felt tears spill over. She'd spent so long being strong, being competent, being the one who held everything together. Having someone see past all of that to the scared woman underneath was almost more than she could handle. Silas pulled her into his arms and let her cry. Didn't try to fix it or make it better. Just held her while years of fear and doubt and loneliness poured out. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were swollen. I look terrible, she said. You look human. Silas wiped her cheeks gently. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be fine. How do you know? Because I've seen you face down angry mobs and deadly diseases without flinching. A bunch of nervous council members doesn't stand a chance. Clara laughed despite herself. That's a terrible pep talk. I'm out of practice. He stood and headed for the door. But for what it's worth, I believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. After he left, Clara lay back down and stared at the ceiling. But this time, instead of anxiety, she felt something different. Hope. The council meeting was held in the town hall, a drafty building that smelled like old wood and lamp oil. 5 council members sat behind a long table, looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes. Clara stood before them in her plainest dress with her medical satchel at her feet. Silas had offered to come, but she'd declined. This was something she needed to do alone. Henry Polk cleared his throat. Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Mr. Polk, Clara kept her voice even. I'll get straight to it. As you know, Doc Brennan isn't returning. The town needs a physician. We'd like to offer you the position. Clara waited. There was always a but in these situations. The salary is modest, Polk continued. Room and board plus $20 a month. You'd have use of Doc Brennan's old office, his supplies, and his equipment. In exchange, you'd provide medical care to anyone who needs it, regardless of ability to pay. Still no but. Clara's guard went up higher. Another council member, a rancher named Davies, spoke up. We know there's been tension, rumors, questions about your past. He looked uncomfortable. But we've seen your work. You've saved lives, delivered babies, treated injuries that would have killed people in other hands. The town needs that, needs you. Clara found her voice. What about Margaret Dunn? She's made her position very clear. Mrs. Dunn is one voice among many, Polk said carefully, and her opinion has evolved after what you did for her nephew. So this is about gratitude, about owing me. Clara's voice hardened. Let me be clear. I don't want this position out of obligation. I want it because you trust me to do the job, not because you feel guilty for how you treated me. The council members shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Davies spoke. You're right. We treated you poorly. Listened to gossip instead of watching what was right in front of us. He met her eyes. But this isn't about guilt. It's about recognizing that you're the best physician this town could ask for, maybe the only one stubborn enough to put up with us. Despite herself, Clara smiled slightly. That's more honest. Miss Whitmore, Polk leaned forward. Do you want this position? Because if you do, it's yours. No strings, no conditions, just honest work for honest pay. Clara thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The failures and the victories, the towns she'd fled and the people she'd saved, the years of loneliness and the terrifying leap of faith she'd taken in staying here. She thought about Silas waiting for her at the ranch, about the life they were building together, about the possibility of having something permanent for the first time in her adult life. I want it, she said, but I have conditions. Polk blinked. What kind of conditions? I won't lie to patients about their chances, I won't promise miracles, and I won't be run out of town the first time someone dies under my care. Clara's voice was steel. People die. That's the nature of medicine. If you can accept that I'll fail sometimes, then I'll take the position. But if you're looking for someone perfect, you need to keep looking. The council members exchanged glances. Then Polk smiled. Miss Whitmore, if we wanted perfect, we'd still be waiting for Doc Brennan to come back. He stood and offered his hand. Welcome to Briar Ridge, officially. Clara shook his hand and something in her chest loosened. After years of fighting to prove herself, years of never being quite good enough, she'd finally found a place willing to accept her as she was. Flawed, scarred, human, and enough. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Clara moved her supplies into the office on Main Street, a small building with 2 rooms and a sign that still read, Dr. Brennan, Physician. Someone painted her name underneath in fresh black letters. Silas helped her organize the space, building shelves for her medicines and hauling in furniture. They worked side by side, and Clara caught herself smiling for no reason except that she was happy. Actually happy. Patients came steadily. Some still approached with nervous uncertainty, but most just needed help and were grateful to receive it. Clara treated everything from splinters to serious injuries and slowly built the kind of medical practice she'd always dreamed of. But she still lived at the ranch, still rode home each evening to find Silas waiting, still sat by the fire with him while they talked about their days, their hopes, their fears. And one evening in late March, when the snow had finally melted and the first green shoots were pushing through the mud, Silas asked her a question. "Marry me." Clara looked up from the medical journal she was reading. "What?" "Marry me." Silas set down his coffee. "I know it's fast. I know we're still figuring things out, but I'm tired of pretending this is temporary. I want you here, permanently, as my wife." Clara's heart hammered. "Silas, you don't have to answer now. Think about it. But I need you to know I love you. I've probably loved you since the day you stood in front of Margaret Dunn and refused to back down. And I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never doubt that you're wanted, that you belong." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know how to be married. I don't know how to be part of something permanent." "Neither do I. Not anymore." Silas smiled slightly. "But we could figure it out together." Clara thought about the life stretching ahead of her, the practice on Main Street, the people who needed her, this man who'd become her home in ways she was still learning to understand. She thought about all the years she'd spent running, all the times she'd convinced herself that belonging was for other people, that she was too damaged, too difficult, too much, and she realized she was tired of believing those lies. "Yes," she said. Silas blinked. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you." Clara set down her journal and moved to sit beside him. "I'm terrified, and I'll probably be difficult, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but yes." Silas pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a fierce joy that made her dizzy. And for the first time in her life, Clara let herself believe that maybe she deserved this, deserved happiness, deserved love, deserved to stay. They were married on a Sunday in early April on the church steps with half the town watching. Clara wore a simple blue dress that Sarah Fletcher had insisted on making for her. Silas wore his best suit and looked so nervous that Clara had to squeeze his hand to keep him steady. Tommy Breslin, the boy whose hand she'd saved, held the church door open with a grin that showed he was missing a tooth. Margaret Dunn sat in the front row and cried openly, and when the minister asked if anyone objected, the silence was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Clara said, "I do," with a voice that only shook slightly. Silas said the same words with absolute certainty, and when they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause. At the reception in the town hall, people came up one by one to offer congratulations. Some apologized for how they'd treated her. Others simply expressed gratitude for everything she'd done. And Clara, who'd spent her whole life on the outside looking in, finally understood what it felt like to belong. Late in the evening, when most people had gone home and the lanterns were burning low, Silas pulled Clara outside into the cool spring air. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Overwhelmed, happy, terrified." Clara leaned against him, all of it at once. "That's marriage for you." Silas wrapped his arms around her. "Or so I'm told." They stood there in the darkness, listening to music drift from the hall and watching stars emerge in the clear sky. And Clara thought about how far she'd traveled to get here. Not just the miles from town to town, but the internal journey from lonely orphan to wandering healer to someone with a home, a husband, a future. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me. When everyone else was looking at what they expected to see, you saw who I actually was." Clara turned to face him. "You saved my life too, you know, just in a different way." Silas kissed her forehead. "Then I guess we're even." They went back inside together, and Clara looked around the room, at the people who'd doubted her, and the people who'd believed. At Margaret Dunn helping clean up, at Tommy Breslin and his mother laughing together, at the town that had become hers not because it was perfect, but because it was real. She thought about the healer she'd been when she arrived, broken and defensive and convinced she didn't deserve anything good. And she thought about who she was now, still flawed, still scared sometimes, but no longer alone. Because that was the thing about healing, Clara realized. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about never failing or never hurting. It was about showing up anyway, fighting anyway, trying anyway. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it was about finding someone willing to fight alongside you. 2 months later, Silas built Clara a small addition to her office, a storage room for supplies, and a private area for examinations. He hung her weathered satchel on a hook beside the door where everyone could see it. That satchel had traveled with Clara through a dozen towns and 100 failures. It had held the medicines that saved lives and the instruments that couldn't. It had been called evidence of fraud and proof of witchcraft and everything in between. Now it hung in a place of honor, and when people saw it, they didn't see a fraud or a charlatan. They saw their healer, their doctor, the woman who'd fought for them even when they didn't deserve it. Clara stood in her office one evening after all her patients had gone, looking at that satchel and thinking about everything it represented, all the pain and failure and stubborn refusal to quit, all the times she could have given up and didn't. Silas appeared in the doorway. "Ready to go home?" Home. The word still felt new in her mouth, but she was learning to trust it. "Yeah," Clara said, taking his offered hand. "Let's go home." They walked out together into the warm spring evening, past the sign that read Clara Boone Physician in fresh paint, past the general store where Henry Polk waved from the window, past the church where they'd been married and the school where children played in the yard. And as they rode back toward the ranch together, toward the life they were building piece by piece, Clara realized something important. She'd spent years running from her past, years trying to escape the failures and the pain and the fear that she wasn't good enough. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. She'd never been running from anything. She'd been running toward something, toward this moment, this place, this person riding beside her with his hand wrapped around hers, toward home. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving. It took more than it gave and broke more people than it built. But for those stubborn enough to endure, for those willing to fight and fail and get back up anyway, it offered something precious, a chance to become who you were always meant to be. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Briar Ridge alone and afraid, carrying nothing but a satchel and a lifetime of wounds. She'd been called a fraud and a killer, been doubted and dismissed and nearly driven out. But she'd stayed. And in staying, she'd found something she'd stopped believing existed. Not redemption, not perfection, just the simple, stubborn truth that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to give up on yourself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who refuses to give up on you either. That was worth more than all the acceptance in the world. That was worth everything.